Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, James Cameron and Robert Rodriguez team up to bring the manga series Alita Battle Angel to the big screen. Set in the 26th century, Dr. Dyson Edo, played by Christoph Waltz, finds a badly damaged cyborg with an intact human brain in a junkyard and gives her a robot body intended for his late daughter, Alita, who he names her after. Alita, played by Rosa Salazar, has no memory of her past, but she soon discovers she has powerful fighting abilities, eventually tracking bounties as a hunter-warrior. Alita befriends street kid Hugo, played by Kean Johnson, but she also attracts the attention of Edo's ex-wife, Sharon, played by Jennifer Connelly, and Vector, played by Mahershala Ali, who rules over the violent cyborg sport Motorball, who is determined to have Alita destroyed. The manga series Battle Angel Alita was first published by Yukito Kishiro in 1990 and was hugely popular and influential to a point where it has actually been adapted several times previously, including notably a very short-lived anime series which only lasted for 2 episodes, only covering the first 2 volumes of the manga as I understand it. Apparently Guillermo del Toro was the one that first introduced James Cameron to the series, and Cameron instantly fell in love with it. He wanted to adapt it to a live-action film version, but the problem was that the technology around that time simply wasn't able to do that. So if you've been following Cameron for the last 2 decades, you'll know of how much he's wanted to do Alita and just kept putting it on the back burner. And apparently there was a point where the technology was able to realise his ideas, but he had to make a choice between whether he was going to pursue Avatar or Alita, and obviously, as we know now, he chose Avatar. But he always kept saying, oh, I'll get to Alita after Avatar. I'll get to Alita after I do the Avatar sequels. Obviously, those Avatar sequels have taken a very long time to come out. It's a decade after Avatar, still no sign of them, so it's clear that Cameron is going to be spending much of the rest of his career making those. So the chances of Cameron himself making Alita became increasingly slim over the years. Robert Rodriguez realised this, and being a good friend of Cameron's, he asked whether he would be the one to bring Alita to the screen. So Cameron would produce it, and he'd co-written a script for the film, but Rodriguez would be the one that would actually direct it, leaving Cameron open to finish off the Avatar sequels that he started. The question with Alita Battle Angel, given its very long development, is whether it will connect with Western mainstream audiences, because anime adaptations have had a very checkered history. You think of the likes of Speed Racer, or infamously Dragon Ball Evolution, which really didn't connect with audiences, or more recently Ghost in the Shell, or as I like to call it, All Shell, No Ghost, which are very much hollow attempts at trying to recreate the anime on screen, but there's always a sense that something's missing from them. There's some spark that makes them work in their original incarnations that simply does not work when it goes through the Hollywood machine. And Alita Battle Angel is probably the closest that any of these movies have ever had to recreating what the source material had, but even so, it still feels like there's something missing. The pieces just aren't all there. Where Alita Battle Angel most succeeds is on a technological level. This is a hugely expensive movie to make, apparently costing in the region of $200 million, and I won't lie, it looks like every penny of that has been spent on screen. When it comes to creating the 26th century cyberpunk world of Iron City and the floating city of Zalem orbiting above it, it is remarkably impressive, just as sheer spectacle goes. And when it comes to world building, I think it really does help that Iron City feels a lot like a genuine, tangible place, helped by the fact there is a lot of practical sets involved in this film, which I think is a very wise decision considering just how CGI heavy it is and just how many of the characters are wholly digital creations. You need something to be tangible for the audience, otherwise you're essentially just watching a cartoon. So they were very wise to do that instead of green screening everything. But really, the main accomplishment does actually come with those cyborg characters, most of whom are actors wearing motion capture suits. Some of them might have live action elements still incorporated in their design. Most notably, Ed Skerin's character has a cutout of his face, but the rest of him has been created digitally, and it really is impressive work when it comes from Weta, who of course worked with James Cameron on Avatar, creating the Na'vi. A lot of their work on that has gone into creating the characters here. You can very much tell that, especially with Alita herself. Every time you watch Alita on screen, she has been wholly created. Even when she's wearing human clothing over the top of a robot endosuit, that too has been created digitally. When Rosa Salazar was on set, not only was she wearing a full-body motion capture suit, but she was also wearing a headset that had a microphone attached to it and two cameras held in front of her face that were tracking her facial performance so that the animators could then rig that to the digital model of Alita. And when you consider that, it only makes Salazar's performance all the more remarkable. I think that Salazar really goes hell for leather in this role, and as a result, she shines through. Her humanity is clearly on display, despite the fact that what we're seeing in the finished product is a wholly digital creation. The final performance is essentially a composite of the work of both Weta and Salazar. Jackie Earle Haley, as one of the film's main antagonists, also is fully digital in much the same way, although I do have to admit that he actually reminded me much more of the Juggernaut in the recent Deadpool 2. I think the downfall with Alita is the stumbling block of the fact that Cameron was very insistent that she had to retain that standard anime look of the gigantic eyes and the small nose, those very artificial looking features, and when you try to make it look photo-real like that, it gets very uncanny valley, because obviously no one really looks like that in real life. It looks very peculiar and a little bit disconcerting. It reminds me of those sort of things where they try and turn Simpsons characters into real-life versions of themselves. Alita, at times, does feel a little bit like that, and there were moments where I got past it, and certainly when it's in a big expressive close-up, the CGI holds up very well there, but it's always a little bit of a distraction. But when it comes to Alita as a character herself, it does feel like she's a collection of anime tropes, especially if you've seen the kind of perfect, idealised anime girl that Alita embodies. She's very sweet, she's very demure, she's often infantilized, especially in the earliest scenes. There's a scene where she's clutching onto a teddy bear, but also she can kick your ass. And I've got to be honest, I'm not really a fan of these kind of characters. In fact, I actually find them to be a little bit creepy, especially in the way that they play out the sort of childlike qualities of them. And I know that's not wholly an anime thing. There's a lot of Western characters that also embody that, like Lilu in The Fifth Element, that Alita reminded me a lot of. And obviously, over the course of the film, her journey is that she loses that innocence as she regains more of her previous life and she learns to embody the warrior that she was originally built to be. I understand that. I just find these kind of characters to be very artificially constructed. And yet, Salazar is so well cast in the role that I actually found myself believing that was her genuine personality. But she does have flaws. She is very temperamental and she does very hasty actions, and sometimes she's a little bit too trusting and naive. There's a big scene where she's offering a character her heart, and of course her heart is a major component of the character because everyone talks about how big it is. It's so huge, it could actually power a city. I mean, that's pretty much surface level allegory here. She is so sweet of a character. And yet, Salazar works so well at making you buy both that side and also the more hardened warrior aspects of her. And I think a large reason why it also works is the relationship she has with Dr. Edo, played by Christoph Waltz. I really like Waltz in this movie, in the sort of father-daughter dynamic that they have. Obviously, he's trying to recreate this sort of surrogate daughter that he lost in the past. He's trying to essentially give a new life to something broken, and that also applies to something within himself. And it's just nice to see Waltz in a role that doesn't typecast him as being a villain, and he seems like he's very sensitive in this role, in the scenes with Alita, in that he's trying to take this more moderate position, whereas Alita is very gung-ho a lot of the time. She's determined to find out more about her past, no matter what the cost, whereas Ido is arguing that maybe just leave the past behind. Those scenes are some of the best in the movie, and when it comes to things that work on an emotional level, that's definitely why the movie survives a lot of the time in its first half. Unfortunately, Waltz becomes a secondary figure in much of the second half of the movie, and it very much suffers for that. I spent a lot of Alita trying to work out, okay, which bits are Cameron and which bits are Rodriguez. The bits that are clearly Rodriguez are the action sequences, which are really intense and propulsive and feel very much like they have his signature all over them. The man knows how to stage action, and they're clearly the highlights of the film, especially in its 3D presentation. But the standout is the motorball sequence, which is a fan favourite of the manga, which is obviously why they've transplanted it from later installments into this film. And it really feels like Rodriguez is enjoying himself in that particular section of the movie. It reminded me of certain other sequences he directed, notably the Mega Race in Spy Kids 3D, only a hell of a lot more violent. That's the other aspect of this movie that feels like Rodriguez. This is a crazily violent movie in spots. I mean, cyborgs are dismembered, decapitated, crushed, and various other horrifying methods of death, but of course, because they're not flesh and blood human beings, PG-13. If the blood was red, it would be a hard R, no doubt. And yet, double standard. Aside from that, it very much feels like Cameron's movie, to its detriment, unfortunately, because that would be the rest of the script. And Cameron's a great director. He's not as great as a writer, and he often has very kind of wonky, clunky dialogue, and that is all the way through Alita. There's a lot of really, really very, very embarrassing expositional dialogue, especially early on. Alita is basically the audience surrogate character because, of course, she's woken up in this world and she has no memory and she doesn't know what anything is. So the first 20 to 30 minutes of this movie are essentially characters walking her around Iron City going, here's that thing, here's this thing, here's that thing, here's that thing. There's no grace to the exposition whatsoever, and what helping this is that Cameron has adapted the manga series very faithfully, to the point where it actually becomes a detriment, because he's trying to incorporate everything about it. And you can't do that in a film incarnation, because obviously nothing will have any room to breathe. And that's the problem that plagues Alita a lot of the time, in that nothing is really given proper time to land or has any kind of weight to it. It always feels like it's rushing to get to the next thing, because there's far too much story to contain in one movie. One of the fundamental faults of this film incarnation is that it's supposed to be an emotional journey that you take with the main character, and yet it fails to transmit that to the audience. And past that is the writing, but it's also the performances as well, especially Keanu Johnson as street kid with a secret Hugo that Alita falls in love with. Their romance is pivotal to the film. It's central, and yet Johnson's performance isn't very charismatic, and he doesn't have enough chemistry with Salazar to make it feel credible in any kind of way. And this isn't helped by the writing, which rushes these characters together. Hugo is introduced the first time that Alita is wandering around Iron City. She's been awake for maybe an hour, and she's falling in love with the first boy she sees. It's just pushing these characters together for the sake of the plot. It's a microcosm of all the wider problems in this film, and it eventually comes home to roost in the final sequences of this movie, where you're supposed to be the most emotionally invested in what's going on between them, and yet I actually found myself laughing at the conclusion of this movie. that's definitely not the response they wanted, but it's in large part because what's going on screen doesn't feel like it makes any kind of sense. In that moment, it feels terribly forced and contrived. They're trying to just transplant events from the manga, and it just doesn't feel right at all. It feels very redundant and repetitive from a story point of view, and it makes the characters look like idiots. As you get deeper into Alita, you realise that the world of the source material just simply isn't suited for the confines of a 2-hour movie, and thus it does the thing that I hate most about franchise adaptations. It basically turns the whole of the movie into Act 1. It's just setting up for more sequels. There are characters that are established and then just disappear. There are plot threads and questions that are just left totally dangling at the end of the movie, and there's no better embodiment of this than the rich people's city of Zala that looms over the film, and you always think, are we going to go there at some point? No, we don't in this movie. Look but don't touch, we're going there in a sequel at some point. It's so frustrating to me on so many different levels. First of all, it makes everything feel really tiny and inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. This is especially true of the villains, played by Mahershala Ali and Jennifer Connelly, who are established as pivotal, key players. And then it turns out, no, they're just minor puppets. They're placeholder villains, essentially, for the much larger foe of Nova from the manga, who mostly appears in this film possessing other characters, particularly Ali's Vector, who otherwise I don't really know very much about him, really. You don't really get much of a sense of a character at all from him. It's a complete waste of 2 Oscar winners. Considering how long Alita has taken to get to the screen, considering the huge amount of expense, and it's unlikely to actually make that budget back, it makes a follow-up seem very distant. So, in all likelihood, what will end up happening is that this will be the only movie being made, and it doesn't feel satisfying. I honestly think that it would have been much better served as a TV series. The film actually feels like 2 episodes of a TV show. At a crucial point around the hour mark, it actually cuts to black, like an episode of a TV show, and you could just pop the credits right in there. And ironically, it pretty much covers about the span of what the anime did. They have essentially spent $200 million getting to the same point the anime did 25 years ago. Alita is such a letdown. It's not without some virtues, and I will admit it is probably the best film that Robert Rodriguez has made in quite a long time, but really, that's because that's a very low bar more than anything. And certainly, when you compare it with the body of James Cameron's work, it's especially a bitter pill. I find myself these days just keep wondering, where did the guy that made films like The Terminator or Aliens or T2 go? His work lately feels like it's got lost in his own technology. Not just this, but also Avatar. I'm really not looking forward to the Avatar sequels. It feels like Cameron has lost himself somewhat. He's lost what made him such an exciting filmmaker when he first started out. And so I found myself watching Alita being very impressed with the special effects, and clearly it's very expensive, but you know what? It's also very hollow.
Alita Battle Angel is a remarkable technical accomplishment, especially when it comes to the title character herself, but it's clear that Cameron and Rodriguez focus far more on that than the story it's supposed to be telling. Despite the efforts of Rosa Salazar as Alita, who shines through the character despite the fact she's a wholly digital creation, the emotional core of the film falls totally flat, especially her pivotal romance with Hugo, thanks largely to Cameron's clumsy script that's full of awkward dialogue and ham-fisted exposition. This is especially apparent in the film's ending, where moments that should feel poignant feel contrived and laughable. Although the notable sequence is an easy standout, the rest of the film is clearly a setup for a sequel that is unlikely to get made, which especially wastes Connolly and Ali as 2 frustratingly undercharacterized antagonists, and this is ultimately a disappointment that feels like the first 2 episodes of a very expensive TV series.
If you like this review, then you can battle on over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.